And now it's time for the keynote speech by Professor Magnus Marsden. I first met Magnus in 2018, I think, in Kabul, when I was working at Afghanistan for Strategic Studies. And since then, he has been a great mentor for me, beside all other scholars. A short introduction to a specialist in Muslim Asia, Magnus has broad interest in anthropological and historical debates about religion, globalization, and identity. His career began as an anthropologist of Pakistan and Islam, working in a volatile region intersected by borders of Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and China, drew him to study mobile merchants in the light of interdisciplinary debate about frontiers, boundaries, and regions, tracing Afghanistan's trading network that connects South and Central Asia to the former Soviet Union. He challenged a scholarship that depicted Afghanistan as a peripheral and theorized changing forms of global connectivity through a consideration of frontier spaces. Today, he is going to deliver a keynote speech on his upcoming book, which is a combination of fieldwork and archival research, titled The Sheep Roads to Central Asia. Please.
Thank you very much indeed. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm just going to make sure that this works. How do I do this? Nothing seems to be. Oh, there we go. Okay. Well, it's a great honor to be invited here today, both by colleagues from Afghanistan and also the University of Pittsburgh, and also to be amidst such esteemed academics whose profound insights into the study of Afghanistan has influenced my thinking and engagement with the country over several decades now. So it's a real pleasure to be here today. I also realize that we're running over time, so I don't want to speak for too long and destroy the rest of the schedule. So I'll try and run over what I'm going to talk about quite quickly, and then we can have discussions about it over the rest of the day. And it's not particularly addressing the sort of specific conference themes in relationship to the Taliban, but I do hope that there are sort of two issues that might come out that are relevant to the circumstances today. One is that I'm going to be talking about Afghanistan and its global connections. And of course, over the past week, we've seen, with attempts to shut down internet connections and so on and so forth, movements in the sort of opposite direction. But at the same time, I also hope to bring some attention to some of the more problematic aspects of international engagement with Afghanistan that continue to have legacies for the country today. And so by way of introduction then, this is of course a picture of the Mando'i in central Kabul. For several years I've been working on cross-border connections, and this started at a quite small scale on the Afghanistan-Pakistan frontier. I'd done some research in Chitral in northern Pakistan in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and on the basis of that became interested in Afghanistan because many of my friends in the village in which I lived in Chitral were originally from Panjshir and Badakhshan. So when they began to return to Afghanistan in the early 2000s, I sort of went with them and became interested in that border region and how people moved across it. But having done that, I realized that these friends of mine didn't only just cross the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, but were also part of much of trading activities that crossed Central Asia. And so in that context, I began to work on the role of people from Afghanistan in trade in Central Asia. And during that work in Afghanistan and Central Asia, I saw also that the connections were much broader. And that led me to become very interested in a city in China called Yiwu, which is the world's hub for the sale of small-scale commodities, where there is a thriving presence of merchants and traders from Afghanistan. So I spent time in Yiwu and also in the sort of various multiple contexts really around the world to which Afghans trade, traders from Afghanistan trade, who are based in Yiwu. And one of the things that emerged during that research was how Afghanistan played a critical role in a sort of inter-Asian world, that much of the scholarship about inter-Asian connections tended to focus on maritime world, the Indian Ocean. But for me, these traders brought attention to the importance of inland connections to that as well, and the ways in which those had persisted through the 21st century. But during that research, I also had a lot of conversations with my friends who I work with from Afghanistan about the forms of trade that had been important to earlier generations, to their fathers and their grandfathers. And one of the issues that came up a lot was the trade in lambskins, or karakul skins that had been particularly important in Afghanistan until the sort of 1970s and 1980s. And I thought that it would be very interesting to sort of look into that historical trade in the 20th century in more detail. So I continued to conduct fieldwork in Afghanistan and northern Afghanistan in particular, but I also tracked down people across a range of settings who had been involved in the trade in karakul skins in London, New York, Istanbul, Vancouver, and even Tel Aviv. Which also then led me to look into archives to see what I could find out about families and companies involved in that trade. So I looked in the India office records, of course, but the London Metropolitan Archives, the Hudson's Bay Company, which are based in Manitoba, and some of the USAID archives in Washington. And another rich seam of material on this for me was the fur trade journals, which were published from the sort of early 1900s up until the 1970s, as well as some private archives and correspondence, and also memoirs of some officials involved in that trade. Particularly interesting one, of course, being Muhammad Khan Jalalah's memoir. I'm sure he's known to many of you. So very briefly then, we all know what karakul fur is in this room. But to sort of briefly recap, it's a type of fur that derives from the skin of a particular breed of sheep, the karakul, that has historically played an important role in clothing in Central Asia, Afghanistan, and South Asia, where it's been often associated with status and hierarchy and masculinity, and also in the context of the 20th century, became associated in South Asia, in India and Pakistan, with a new form of national identity in Pakistan, where, of course, the jinnah hat made from karakul became a sort of signifier of Pakistan national identity. But it's a product that also became increasingly popular in Europe and America, especially after the 1850s, when furs from wild animals became increasingly hard to source as a result of the exploitation of fur-bearing animals in both North America, but also in Siberia. Whereas in Asia, fur was associated with clothes worn by men, in particular hats. In Europe and North America, it became a key vehicle of fashion for women, to the extent that one cultural studies scholar argues that fur symbolized femininity, erotic power, and luxurious excess. So very briefly then, I just want to talk a little bit about the history of where this fur came from. And as I've said, from the 1850s onwards, there was increasing shortage of furs available from wild animals in Siberia and North America, that led fur companies in Europe to turn instead to the skins of the lambs of karakul sheep, which were found largely in Central Asia, in Bukhara and the Zarafshan Valley, where nomadic pastoral communities studied by Professor Barfield here, including Arabs, but also Turkmen, raised flocks of karakul sheep and used them for multiple purposes. But from the 1850s onwards, an increasing focus was the extraction of the skins from lambs for the production of furs. To turn these skins into these rich and glossy furs was a complex process that involved artisans in cities like Bukhara, first putting these skins in a quash, what was called an oshkhana, in a sort of mixture of water and oatmeal, stored in cows' stomachs for several days before they were cleaned. The furs were cleaned and left to dry in the sun. Until the sort of beginning of the 20th century, a various range of people were involved in the trade of furs to Europe in particular, including regional merchants who could be both Muslim and also Jewish. But it was also a trade in which the Central Asians' political authorities were heavily invested, including the Emir of Bukhara and his court officials. And then from the early 1900s, German companies based in the city of Leipzig also increasingly began to seek to establish agencies and offices in Central Asia in an attempt to cut out the middlemen traders who they saw as sort of being problematic and difficult to work with. And at this point, northern Afghanistan played a role, so caracal skins did move across the border from northern Afghanistan into Central Asia, but the sort of center of gravity remained in the Emirate of Bukhara until a little later. I can just move this. Now, after the Russian Revolution of 1917, however, the center of gravity of the trade really did move to Afghanistan because, as we know, thanks to the work of Professor Shahrani and others, many Central Asian parcelists and, of course, Professor Barfield moved from Central Asia into northern Afghanistan in large numbers, taking their flocks with them and bringing this new large-scale industry to Afghanistan. It was in that context that another well-known personality in the literature, Abdul Majid Zabali, established a joint stock company connected to the newly established National Bank of Bank Milli of Afghanistan, of course, and introduced a series of legislation which sought to take control of this trade from people that he described as being foreigners, in particular those Jewish traders I'd mentioned earlier, who had been particularly active in the trade. Interestingly, however, despite this, the attempts to sort of put the trade in a sort of monopoly form, older networks continue to operate. And there are fascinating reports in the colonial era literature about networks that enabled skins to be moved across the newly created border between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, that involved the movement of Russian currency through Jewish and also Hindu money networks to Peshawar, from where the money was moved to bankers based in Paris and then shifted back through other networks back into the Soviet Union. So whilst there were attempts by the state of Afghanistan in this period to monopolize and control the trade, older networks persisted and continued to be influential. It wasn't only skins that were moving, however. There was also the caracal sheep themselves became increasingly mobile in the 20th century. And there was a growing interest in the West now, also in Europe and America, about the caracal sheep, which became known as the noblest of all sheep and became associated with as a sort of telescopic history of civilization. Some even conjectured that the ram sacrificed by Abraham atop the Mount Moriah was itself an ancestor of the caracal. And against this backdrop, too, caracal sheep moved globally. One of the places in which they became particularly important source of economic life was in the German colony of Southwest Africa, now known as Namibia. And the historical work on that points to the role of the German state and German state officials in bringing this new type of industry to Namibia to Southwest Africa as a way of bolstering the German colonial economy. But at the same time, the networks that I've just introduced were also active. So again, there are intelligence reports from the British embassy in Kabul in the 1930s saying that Jewish traders in Kabul have close relations with Southwest African sheep breeders, and were arranging ways of moving sheep from Afghanistan to Africa. And indeed, a sort of small flock of caracal sheep crops up in intelligence reports in Palestine in the 1930s en route to Southwest Africa. Even though, of course, because this is such an important breed for Afghanistan, there are strict export controls placed by the government of Afghanistan, obviously, on their movement. But there were still these global connections operating despite those attempts to control them. Oh, sorry, no, that was this is a funny slide, I have to say. One of the sort of slightly interesting stories, and also about caracal sheep and their globalization, is the role of America. There was a veterinary scientist in America who was called C.C. Young. He was a son of a Bessarabian sheep breeder. Bessarabia is what is Ukraine, who traveled to Central Asia in the early 20th century and brought back small samples of flocks of caracal sheep to America, where he hoped to move the industry from Central Asia to America. Interestingly, when the sheep arrived at the relevant port, I think it was in New York, the US custom officials didn't let them enter the territory because of import rules. But none other than Roosevelt, who was at the time a senator, wrote a letter to support the disembarkation of these caracal sheep into America. And Young went on to call one of the rams that he'd imported from Afghanistan Teddy. Obviously Teddy Roosevelt. Unfortunately, Teddy the ram lost his life having been kicked to death by a zebra at the Agricultural Research Center of the US Department of Agriculture in Maryland. But these attempts to bring the caracal industry to America didn't work because it was a very complicated thing. Because in order to create coats out of these sheep, you needed vast numbers of skins, all of the same color. And it was just simply impossible for producers in America to have those number of skins. And also the value of the sheep the value of money from meat was far greater than from skins. So in the 1930s then, and into the early 1940s, we have a very global trade in these caracal skins. And initially, the center of Afghanistan's connection to this was the city of Leipzig in Saxony, in Germany, where there was a historic street known as the Bund, where Jewish fur traders and other Saxon merchants had traded in skins for centuries. And most of the skins would reach Leipzig by way of a trade fair held each year in Russia in the city of Nizhny Novgorod. And this was such an important place for Afghanistan at the time that King Amanullah Khan visited, I think his grand tour was in 27-28, was that? So 1928, I think, he paid a visit to one of the key firms involved in the caracal trade in Leipzig. But that all changed after, in the 1930s, when Nazi Germany resulted in many of the Jewish traders based in Leipzig leaving. And so this center of gravity of the trade shifted to London. And in London in particular, the HBC, or Hudson's Bay Company, played a particularly important role in marketing the skins and also organizing the auctions in which they were held. And in London, the auctions were largely held in this HBC company house known as Beaver House, which is today located in the City of London. trying to get this thing to move. And again, this had also been a historic centre of the fur trade. And in the 30s, it became of vital importance for Afghanistan's economy, with up to 1.5 million pounds worth of caracal skins being auctioned there in the late 1930s. And many of the trading companies in London were run by Jewish traders and also some Muslim traders from Afghanistan and Central Asia. This is a picture of the auction house and the locations in which the skins were warehoused prior to sale. And most of the traders from Central Asia who had moved to London at this point were basically acting as brokers and commission agents who had an expert knowledge in how to identify high quality skills and also sell them on the market. We'll move over some of these slides because I don't want to ruin the rest of the day. But one of the interesting things is at this point, the Central Asians who came to London to deal in the skins were regarded as innovators by British firms. They were said to bring new skills, new ways of assorting and valuing and marketing the skins. And their expertise that they'd gathered in Central Asia and Russia was highly valued, and they came to be employed in leading firms. That's not to say that there weren't frictions. There were regular frictions and commercial disputes, as one would expect, over the payment of sums of money due for the purchase of skins to Afghanistan. And sometimes these also became a sort of matter of international dispute. And of course, at the time, Britain was seeking to improve its relations with Afghanistan, fearing growing German involvement in the country. And the British government often stepped in order to encourage British-based firms to resolve their disputes. Unfortunately, nothing really remains of this old trade in London today. The former Beaver House is now this horrible glass-built building, as is much of central London. And what happened in the post-war era is particularly interesting. That's to say, after the end of the Second World War. And after the Second World War, well, I should say, before the Second World War, there'd been a big tension in the Hudson's Bay Company between the British fur merchants who emphasized the importance of traditional skills and learned through being involved in the trade through generations, and then the Canadian fur bosses in HBC who emphasized the importance of modern business practice and knowledge. After the Second World War, the modernizers within the HBC had largely won out, but that distinction between modern and traditional instead became imposed on the relationship between East and West. And the HBC increasingly came to regard Afghanistan and merchants in Afghanistan and from Afghanistan and Central Asia as a problem that need to be resolved. And in places like New York, we often see what the records attest to is the extreme skill and adeptness of officials with Afghan government bodies, but also Afghan merchants from Afghanistan, really playing a very major role in maintaining profit margins and reducing the ability of the HBC to increase its commission charges on their activities. But in response, the HBC managers, who are increasingly frustrated, often resort to sort of orientalizing or even racializing stereotypes, talking about incompetence, corruption, and the Oriental mentality of the merchants and officials from Afghanistan with whom they work. This is a picture at the time, and I think this is from 1957, with the governor of the Bank-e-Milli of Afghanistan on a visit to the skin houses in London. And next to him is a man called Abdul Reja, who was a major player in the establishment of something called the Afghan Caracal Institute, which was established in the late 1960s. And the other picture you can see there, the man on the right is a a skin merchant of Bukharan Jewish heritage. I'm trying to... and these are interesting figures who I've come across during my research. On this side is a skin merchant originally from Herat, Shamum Eshkeri, who traded in skins between London and Herat until the 1970s. And on the other side, two also Jewish merchants originally from Herat, whose families were involved in the skin trade. And it wasn't only the sort of government institutions of Afghanistan with whom the HBC had problems. They also increasingly began to blame the difficulties that they faced in the trade on the older networks of Jewish Central Asian Persian-speaking networks with whom they worked. So there's a fascinating character called Simchayev, Eli Simchayev, who was from Kokand in Central Asia initially, who rose to a very high position in the HBC Karakul First Skin Department, and was initially lauded for his skills as in multiple languages and his connections. He was a very close friend of Abdul Majid Zabali, for example. But over time, the HBC began to see him as a problem, accused him of being neurotic and of the older merchant networks of bringing undesirable assortments of skins to the international trade. And the next phase of the trade was really in the Cold War period. And in this period, the HSB sought to directly influence the industry in Afghanistan itself. And basically, they felt that the managers made the assessment that for years they'd been involved in the skin trade, but they had few relations themselves with government officials from Afghanistan. And so instead sought to, again, cut out the middlemen, traders, and to work directly with officials in the country. And it was in that backdrop, against that backdrop, trying to get this slide, that HBC joined in a partnership in the late 1960s with USAID and the British Ministry of Development to modernize the trade. And part of this revolved around the establishment of an Afghan Karakul Institute that was led by Mr. Reja, whose picture you saw earlier, that was going to sort of modernize the ways in which the skins were sorted and marketed in Afghanistan. And as part of this agreement, two people went from the UK and Britain to offer expert advice in Afghanistan, one of them being a man called Henry Williser, a skin sorter who'd been based in London, and another, Al Feldman, a well-known fur trader based in New York. Unfortunately, but not unexpectedly, the interaction seems to have been a disaster, because within a year, Henry Williser had been kicked out of Afghanistan because merchants in the country had accused him of selling trade secrets to HBC, and Al Feldman had irritated the Ministry of Commerce so much with all of his paperwork that he was also asked to leave. But at that point, though, there were sort of up to 4 million Karakul skins being sold in both London and New York. From the 1980s, however, there's a dramatic collapse in the trade, largely because of changing consumer preferences in Europe and America. Obviously, there was an anti-fur movement led by animal rights activists that changed the wearing skins by women as a mark of fashion to instead as proof that women were cruel. And so there instead became a movement for fashions to reject the use of fur. But it was also affected by the anti-apartheid movement because of those Karakul flocks in Southwest Africa, or Namibia by that point. And then, of course, the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan also affected the trade dramatically. And so the last auction of Karakul skins in Afghanistan was held in London was held in 1989. And from that point onwards, the auctions have been held in Copenhagen, and today they're held in Helsinki by the only remaining fur auction company. But whilst in the 70s you had 4 million pelts being sold on market, today there's a maximum of 30,000, most of which are sourced from Afghanistan and Central Asia. And just to bring it up to the present day, what are the sort of legacies of this? And here again, we find the scholarship of our colleagues in the room extremely helpful. Because, of course, the sort of commercialization of sheep breeding and farming in pastoral activities in Afghanistan, both for the production of meat, but also for the production of skins, resulted in what Professor Barfield referred to as the sort of emergence of a rural sub-proletariat, who were basically paid to act as shepherds by capitalists and investors in the rural field. With the sort of decline of this trade, however, we know that the rural economies of Afghanistan, northern Afghanistan, went through extremely difficult period in the 1980s and 90s. And today, one of the interesting things that I think would be interesting to look at is the sort of international market for shepherds from northern Afghanistan. So families sending one son or more to work as shepherds in Turkey for major Turkish sheep breeders, often illegal, often extremely poorly paid, and with few, if any, rights in Turkey. And there were attempts in the 2000s, after 2001, to once again revitalize the industry in Afghanistan. So I spoke to the president of the Karakul Sheep Breeders Association of Namibia, who had been paid by the Danish Development Agency to go to Afghanistan in 2003 and spend time in Mazar-e-Sharif to revitalize the industry and offer his advice. And he told me that he was told to teach sheep people involved in the trade how to cure the skins according to modern methods. And he spent a few days in Mazar-e-Sharif doing this. But he also mentioned to me that the whole project was a complete waste of time because everybody knew that the best quality, most supple skins on the market at that point were those from Afghanistan using traditional techniques imported in the country. And really it was a question, as we've already heard from this morning, of not fully recognizing the talents and skills of actors in Afghanistan themselves. There are also other very fascinating little legacies that I've found as well that interest me. One is Afghanistan's ties to Africa and Central Asia's ties to Africa continue to be visible through this old skin trade. A couple of years ago, for example, the head of the Secret Services of Botswana was found to have been was found to have taken a kickback in a contract that he'd drawn up with a firm in Dubai run by someone from Afghanistan that provided technology for cross-border surveillance. And the kickback had been paid in none other than Karakul sheep imported to Botswana from Uzbekistan. And that sort of became a major scandal in the Botswana press. So, of course, without this understanding this history, that would look like some sort of aberration. But of course, there's 100 years of sort of Africa, Central Asia, Afghanistan connections that actually inform those type of dynamics. So just to sum up then, if I can get to the next slide. So I've just tried then today, and I hope I haven't taken too much time, to explore some of these commercial and social worlds forged in Afghanistan and around it at multiple sort of types and scales of frontiers. We've heard about resource frontiers that bring us the history of Afghanistan into conversation with the history of Siberia and of North America in terms of the fur and the fur trade, but also, of course, political frontiers and how actors from Afghanistan and the wider region have created networks of remarkable religious and cultural complexity and plurality, to go back to a theme of the conference, that have persisted over time. And in terms of those networks, I've tried to emphasize the agency of people involved in them, so not merely just being the sort of products of colonial power or of international development, but as influencing the nature of the trade in their own terms. How those networks have been resilient in the face of displacement, which many, if not all of you, have experienced, of course, but also hostile state legislation, another theme, unfortunately, that is important today, and even in the attempts to control the trade by multinational companies such as the HBC. It's also this work has also led me to rethink the sort of idea of inter-Asia, and to really question that in the sense that these networks and this merchant life is in fact intercontinental, which requires us to bring Afghanistan and Central Asia into conversation with dynamics in Europe, North America, and Africa. And really, once again, underscores the critical and important role that Afghanistan has played, not only in the history of the region, but also in the world in which we live today. Thank you very much, and it's been lovely. If you'd like some questions, I'd be happy to.
Thank you so much. This is really interesting and kind of the global nature of trade. And it's not, I think, those of us who were schooled in the West tend to think it's a Western invention. So this is very good to understand and know. I'm curious, you had mentioned some legislation. What led to that legislation? What made that possible kind of from a political culture standpoint?
Yeah, the legislation is things that excellent historians such as Robert Cruz has written about. So the legislation basically pertained to trying to prevent some quote unquote minority groups in Afghanistan from playing a central role in trade, and those included Jewish merchants, Hindu and Sikh merchants, and also indeed the activities of other Muslim groups who had come to Afghanistan from Central Asia around 1917. And I think that needs to be seen in the context of the nature of the development of the state in Afghanistan in that period, and the attempt to fashion a sort of all-embracing nation state and a new form of perhaps national identity as well. So I think it was in that context, and then also a broader sort of imperial context in which that legislation was introduced.
Thank you very much. So just basically a quick question, because, I mean, it's true, it's a luxury trade, and then, it's like lots of money basically involved in this. But then I was just wondering about the people inside Afghanistan, particularly how they would see, this process of killing this baby lambs. So was there any kind of discussion or dialogue between people, how cruel this is? Could be a haram or something like that as well?
Yeah, that's a very important something that I found particularly interesting, because of course, and I did as well, I stepped into the trap myself today by talking about the anti-fur trade movement in the West. But there are also very vigorous debates in Afghanistan about this act of killing these lambs, because the lambs are killed at basically birth. And so some of the merchants I've spoken to say that their fathers told them to never be involved in the trade in caracal skins, because basically there's no barakat in it, because it's involved in the killing of these baby lambs very young, and that's sort of cruel. And there's another argument which goes sort of beyond that, and I find quite interesting, which is that because the meat is actually eaten from the baby lamb. There's various dishes that are consumed in northern Afghanistan from this lamb, but the other argument is that it's actually a cruelty on the mother, on the sheep, because she has a natural instinct to lick the skin of her young lamb, and she can't fulfill that instinct, which also makes it cruel and sort of some people would say haram. So and those discourses are important within Afghanistan. And then other people have told me that even at the sort of height of caracal fashion in the 1970s, that their fathers had told them, had banned people in the family from wearing caracal hats on the grounds of the sort of cruel practices in which it was involved. So one man told me, you know, my father didn't mind getting himself another wife and treating my mother cruelly, but when it came to the question of care for lambs, then it was a boundary that he wasn't willing for anyone to cross. So all of those debates were there. But then the Taliban's perspective on this is also quite interesting. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to get in-depth material, but there's a lot of rumours that maybe Professor Barfield and others would know more, that at least in the first period of Taliban government, there was a sort of ban on, or at least restrictions on the trade of caracal skins. Whether that's due to the treatment of the lamb, or whether it's due to the sort of international European-focused nature of the trade, I'm not sure, but it would be interesting. And other merchants say that the trade is lacking barakat because it was so dependent on international stock markets. So basically, one year you could invest a lot of money into buying skins and shipping them to London, and then the next year you could lose everything by doing the same thing. So that you never, so there's an inherent lack of stability in the trade, and that by being involved in it, you put yourself in a sort of unnecessarily risky position. But there are lots of very interesting moral and ethical debates about the trade in Afghanistan and among communities in the country.
You have a multiple source, you did interview or archive. How did you validate the data? What's your approach for the validating the data?
For validating?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how many people do you interview with them? Yeah.
Yeah. That's a very good question. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of people, basically from lots of different backgrounds, whose families have been involved in this trade over a long period of time. And what happens when doing sort of anthropological research is that one begins to hear things quite regularly. And rather than there being a science in terms of validation, sort of certain expected assumptions begin to come across. And so rather than treating them as fact, one is thinking of these things as being an important aspect of people's worlds, which means that they're important also to discuss. But with this research, it's been very interesting too, that I've been able to look at archival work, fur trade magazines and other sort of archival documents that have then allowed me to, you know, if people had mentioned that these traders had been involved in the skin trade and they'd made vast sums of money out of it, then I've actually looked at the ledgers of the auction books of HBC and found the same names crop up time and time again. So it's a sort of, this research has been interesting. Lots of different sources has sort of shaped it all, basically. Thank you.
Fascinating presentation and research. We really appreciate and look forward to reading the book. I'm wondering what the economic contribution of this trade was to the producers as well as to the merchants, you know, through the period that you're covering. How significant contribution was this trade?
I mean, I think for as a whole for the Afghanistan's economy, it was very substantial. And it was, and you know, international governments, US in particular, would often say that, and HBC too as a company would say that the Afghanistan's foreign exchange reserves basically depend on this trade, and so therefore it's a major leverage that we have over the country in terms of negotiations that we conduct in terms of debt repayments and all of those type of things. So at a macro level, I think it was really significant. In terms of the producers, I would imagine you both will probably know more, because that unfortunately is not something I've been able to look at in that level of detail. But for the merchants, it was very important, and not only for individual merchants, because who would often be involved both in caracal skins, but also in other trades to do with food products and other things like Akhmarad Boy, for example, the famous Turkmen trader was involved in this, karakul skins, carpets, and then also agricultural products, a whole range of things. And I think karakul did play a big role in that. So I think it was quite major for the merchants and quite a major foundation. And yes, and also the other interesting thing is that they, in terms of the producers and the smaller scale merchants, is that from the 1940s, even earlier 30s, they established cooperatives, like the Ankhoi cooperative, the Turkmen cooperative, which brought them together. And people that I've met have said that they invested their money in sort of building infrastructure and things and buildings in Kabul, which even today they continue to make a sort of some type of an income through via rents, which are then shared between the sort of ancestors of the people who established them. So I think it was quite major for the merchants.
Just one question online through Zoom. We have someone asked that Turkmens of Afghanistan were involved in this trade. In your research, did you find any evidence and the way they have contributed to the trade and on Karakol and beyond? And I may ask a question. Recently, a book came on rule of use ID, the quiet violence of empire, how use ID shaped Afghanistan in post 1945, where it discusses how the projects that use ID funded in Afghanistan, they were not just about development and economics. They were also a kind of means to reshape identity, reshape communities, and advocate certain patterns of rights. And most of these projects since 1940s were failed. The ones which were implemented in Helmand, or very recent ones which were counter-narcotic projects in Jalalabad. Now, in your research, you mentioned rule of use ID in early stages, 1960s. How was the interaction between use ID investment and projects on Karakol, just as an economic or a trade issue, and to the fact that they were also shaped in a way to reimagine society, reimagine identity, and present a new forms of self?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. So firstly, with Turkmens, a very major role in this whole skin trade, especially those communities who moved from Central Asia to Afghanistan in the 1920s, who came in, tens of thousands. And many of the major merchants, people who later became merchants, were Turkmen. Also, the Turkmen had very close relation with the Jewish merchants, who by this point were very international by the 1930s. And those relationships were really pivotal to this trade. So that Eli Simchaev I mentioned, one of his abilities was the fact that he had these close ties to the Turkmen merchants and also the Turkmen cooperatives and the pastoralists themselves. So they were absolutely pivotal. And then into the 60s, 70s, people like Haji Ahmad Bai were, amongst the biggest of the traders in Turkmen skin. So Turkmen's critical. In terms of the US aid, I mean, I didn't have enough time to do proper research in the archives, but what I saw is that there's clear indications that this was part of an attempt to sort of change and engineer society and the social structures of Afghanistan. So with the creation of the Afghan Karakul Institute, the aim is to, which is a sort of non-government self-financing organization. And one of the aims is to create what they refer to as a new class of entrepreneurial middle class whose ideas will be inclined towards democracy and support for the West. And that's something that is directly articulated in terms of the development of these contracts with HBC and with the Karakul industry in Afghanistan. Very upfront aspect of the policy.